Good afternoon. My name is Margarita Talaikovskaya, and I greet you on the Radunь land, which is rich in multinational history and its famous people. I invite you to the fascinating excursion tour, Radunь, the center of Jewish spiritual heritage. Visiting our tour, you will get to know Jewish cultural and historical objects connected with the life and work of the outstanding Talmud scholar Hafiz Chaim, expositions and exhibits of the School People's Historical and Local History Museum, which will tell you the history of life and activity of the Radunь Jews of the 19th century. The mass grave of the victims of the genocide, which will reveal you the history of the destruction of Jewish population of Radunь and its surroundings. Let's start with the historical site Yeshiva. At the beginning of the last century, Radunь was a typical Belarusian provincial town with a leisurely life. In the center of Radunь, as well as in many other settlements, there were stone houses, and the first floors of these houses were busy with brisk trade. The Jewish community in Radunь was friendly and united. But at some point, Radunь suddenly became the center of the cultural life of all the Jews of the world. People began to come here to listen to the lessons and lectures of the outstanding Talmud scholar Israel Meir HaKohen, known as Hafiz Chaim from Radunь. We are at the walls of the Jewish yeshiva, which is very attractive, and at the beginning of the 20th century it gained fame as the best in Eastern Europe. By the way, yeshiva in Jewish history is the name of the institution, which is the highest religious educational establishment designed to study the oral law, mainly the Talmud. For about 2000 years, yeshiva remains the main center where traditional Jewish culture is preserved and developed. Hafiz Chaim built the yeshiva in 1904 with his own money. Hafiz Chaim was born in 1838 in the town of Dyatlova, Grodno province. He studied the Torah under the guidance of his father. At the age of 18, he moved to Radunь. At the age of 35, he published his first book, Hafiz Chaim, which in Russia means thirsty for life. It is dedicated to the loss of purity of speech. This work has glorified the author, who has since been more often called Hafiz Chaim than his own name. But his most famous work is Mishnah Brura, which is adopted in all modern Jewish communities as an authoritative code of Torah laws and regulations established by sages. He studied and read a lot. He lived humbly, working in his wife's shop. After receiving the title of rabbi, he refused to get rabbi's salary. Hafiz Chaim's house was situated here, next to the yeshiva. But unfortunately, his house in Radunь was deconstructed and taken to the USA in 2001-2002. Of course, it will be saved in the USA, but our Belarus lost one more historical object. The rabbi left a great cultural heritage. His first book on the prohibition of slander is very honored among the Jews and is the second most popular one after the Torah. 12 major rabbis of different countries of the world came out of the walls of Radunь Yeshiva, and about 200 students were trained in it. In 1913, more than 300 students were engaged in the yeshiva of Hafiz Chaim, which became one of the world's centers for studying the Torah. The activities of Hafiz Chaim are continued by his grandson Rav Hillel Zaks, the head of the yeshiva Hebron in Jerusalem.
We invite you to the historical site Hafiz Chaim's tomb. We are in the Jewish cemetery where the spiritual leader of the Jews, Rabbi Hafiz Chaim, is buried. The grave is a landmark and the place visited by Jews from all over the world. This grave was found, updated and restored recently. Israel Meir died in Radunь on the 15th of September 1933, where he was buried on the eve of Adolf Hitler's coming to power. They say that before his death he suddenly exclaimed, "Millions will die, and we haven't done anything." This again confirms that Hafez Chaim felt the growth of surrounding anti-Semitism and the approaching Holocaust. After the Second World War, non-Jewish residents of Radun refused to transfer the remains of Hafez Chaim to reburial in the land of Israel. They claimed that it was thanks to the grave of the great righteous man that Radun was the only place in the whole district which escaped destruction, and they didn't want to part with such protection. Every year hundreds of pilgrims come to Radun, or Radin as the town is called by Jews. They believe that on the day of his death, the soul of Hafez Chaim attends his grave and helps those who come to the cemetery. On the day of the rabbi's death, on the 24th of July, according to the Jewish calendar, according to the Gregorian calendar in 2017, this day falls on the 14th of September. Believing Jews from Israel, the United States, Canada, France, Russia, and other countries visit the grave of Hafez Chaim for mass prayer. As the Jews say, Radun is the place of miracles. Changes and real miracles begin to happen in their lives after they pray here. So they try to come to Radun on this day, walk along the street that Rabbi went by, look at the nature that he saw. And of course, they pray for themselves, for their families, for peace, for good relations not only between Jews, but between different nations.
On the 1st of July 1941, Radun was occupied by the troops of the Wehrmacht. In November, a ghetto was created in which 1,834 people were imprisoned, including people from nearby villages. In the spring of 1942, all the still living Jews of Radun were driven to a square in the center of the town and kept there under guard without any food and water. Those who tried to run away were killed immediately. Witnesses reported more than 70 such cases. 2 to 3 days later, police and gendarmes arrived from Vassilishki. The prisoners were driven to the Jewish cemetery 100 meters west of Radun. Many of the prisoners were shot on the road. The doomed people were forced to dig a ditch, undressed to underwear, and then all of them were shot. Children were thrown up and shot in the air as targets, and a lot of people were buried alive. Only few people managed to escape death, and among them is one of the inhabitants of Radun, Stolar Meyer. On the 10th of May 1942, Nazis and local policemen killed 2,130 people during the complete liquidation of the ghetto. It was almost the whole Jewish population of Radun and nearby villages. And among them there were 314 women and 298 children. At this time the chief of the gendarmerie in Radun was a German Lizek by surname, and the chief of the police was Iosif Volashkevich. The property and belongings of the murdered Jews were brought to one place, plundered by both the Germans and the Polish, and the rest of the belongings were sold out. After the liberation, only 32 Jews returned to Radun. Unfortunately, very few tombstones were preserved in the place of the old Jewish cemetery, because the Germans practically destroyed the cemetery during the war. In 1961, a monument was erected on the grave of victims of the genocide of Jews in Radun, a sculpture of a warrior with a submachine gun. Later, another monument to Radun Jews, the victims of the Holocaust, was erected in the town.
We continue our tour. Radun is the center of the Jewish spiritual heritage. And our last historical site is People's Museum of Local History of Radunskaya Secondary School. The Museum of Local History was established in 1998 in Radunskaya Secondary School. The exposition of the museum has about 1,000 exhibits associated with more than 630-year history of the settlement. The museum has an exposition whose materials tell about the history of the life of Jews Photographs and pictures from the history, daily life and activities of Radun Jews of the 19th-21st centuries. Photocopies of the Acts of the Radun Jews 1649-1792. Materials about the life and work of the famous rabbi, Talmudist and writers Hafetz Chaim. The books The Thirsty for Life and The Laws Prohibiting Slander. The museum's materials show that at the beginning of the village's history, Jews were forbidden to come and settle here. Later, when Radun was granted the Magdeburg Law in 1538, farmers, including Jewish ones, began active cultivation of the surrounding lands, settling and taking root in the village. After less than a century, a large Jewish community was formed there, which was under the patronage of Grodno. 3 decades later, there were 581 officially living Jews in Radun. In 1847, there were 283 Jews in Radun. In 1897, 896. In 1921, about 800 Jews. In 1935, 90% of the population of the town were Jews. In 1912, there was a Jewish loan and savings partnership. In 1913, the Jews owned the only warehouse of chemist goods and both manufacturing shops in the town. The sphere of the activity of the Jewish community extended to trade, agriculture and crafts. In 1921, 12% of the Jewish shareholders were farmers. The town was world famous. There was a Jewish spiritual academy, Talmudic, which was headed by the famous Talmudist Israel Meyer Hafetz Chaim from Radun. Young people, even from far abroad, came to study in this academy. As you can see, our town has a great past, thanks to people of different nationalities that coexisted on the territory of our district during several centuries. Today you have got acquainted with Radun as the center of the Jewish spiritual heritage, and you can see that our town is certainly worth visiting.
Our tour ends. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the tour and acquired a lot of useful knowledge. I will be glad to see you again in Radun. All the best to you. Goodbye.